Welcome to our open faith discussion at Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. My name is Steve, and we are talking today about the new Disney Plus Marvel TV series, Loki, which came out this week. And the first episode introduced us to a religion of sorts, a new backstory for the Marvel universe. And we saw Loki become a time variant, kind of destroying. Oh, I should say spoilers right now, everybody. If you haven't seen Loki with Disney Plus, you need to go check it out, because we're going to talk today about some of the religious aspects, the free will versus determinism argument. See, here at Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure, we have had discussions in the past on previous videos about free will versus determinism. We like to talk about religious topics. Three of us here right now on this particular call are active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with our own thoughts and theories and opinions about all of that. And then one, Joey here, Presbyterian. And we have other participants who occasionally join us. But today we're talking about Loki. And again, we've talked about the Truman Show in the past and religion in the Truman Show. So this seems like it's right up our alley to say, hey, look, here comes Loki this week, first episode in a new series. And it's got a heavy religious element to it. Let's talk about it. So who wants to start with something they noticed in the episode about Loki and this religious theory or free will versus determinism? And let's just get some discussion going. Anybody want to begin? Joey, you got a quote you want to start with?
Well, I mean, I can maybe make just like an opening statement, I guess. Like, I'm a big fan of movies that involve time travel, movies and TV shows. And because of my particular philosophical bent toward compatibilism, I don't use the word determinism, but compared to what you believe, it's closer to determinism than to what's called a libertarian, metaphysical libertarian free will, right? And so whenever I do watch time travel movies, I prefer the ones where there is some kind of determinism. I believe it's either the second or the third Terminator movie where, and I'm going to spoil that movie, but it's the one where as sort of a grown-up John Connor is trying to run from his sort of destiny. The whole entire movie, he's running. He doesn't want to become this great general that he's supposed to become, right? And in the way that it ends up, he ends up in this bunker, and he's got like the only working radio in the world. And it's like the perfect place for him to become exactly what he's been destined to become all along. And so he, and I think it ends up with like, you can run from your fate, but it's going to catch up with you, like, which is weird because the other two Terminator movies are like, you can change the future, if there isn't a fate, right? The Terminator movies are really all over the map in terms of free will versus determinism. And frankly, they're movies, right? They're entertainment. I'm not expecting them to be rigorous in their philosophical or theological. And I have no idea where Loki's going to go. I'm fully prepared for Loki to take a sharp left turn at some point. And I don't know what the multiverse is going to like break down and start to go toward chaos, right? And all this shtick about the one sacred timeline and all this determinism is just going to go right out the window. I fully expect that. I would be pleasantly surprised if it does end up like that one Terminator movie where it all comes full circle right back to exactly where it was supposed to be. And Loki thinks that all along he's making all these choices, and really it was just he's ending up right where he was supposed to be. I would be delighted if that's how it ends, but I'm prepared for it to go either way. But I'm like strapped in. My tray table is up. I'm like ready for all of it.
Watch.
I'm ready to, yeah, this show is, I'm strapped in.
I thought it was interesting from the very beginning of the episode where the first thing that happens is, them telling the Hulk to take the stairs. And in the first time through in the Avengers, when he took the stairs and they weren't already going back in time, trying to collect all the Infinity Stones and everything, not a big deal. But because they told him to do that, and he got so upset that the second time when they went back in time, that it almost seems like chance. What if they hadn't told him to take the stairs? Then none of this would have ever happened, And so it introduces it with this feeling of, oh, this is because you told the Hulk to take the stairs, and then everything just went off. And And yet it's all supposed to happen then, as they talk about later, according to the sacred timeline. But it gets so confusing to me. Now, maybe I'll start right here. Help me out to understand what's going on for a second. Help me to wrap my brain around it if you guys know. But the first question I had was, why can't they just stick Loki back right where he was when he took the Tesseract and disappeared? And I figured that one out. I mean, because everything after that in the Avengers and the way that they then went back in time again to find the Tesseract in another location and everything happened because Loki took that Tesseract and disappeared. So they couldn't just put him back with the Tesseract, because that would ruin the sacred timeline of events of how the Avengers, got all of them. But my next question that I haven't been able to figure out yet is this. Okay, now I've got to wrap my brain even around the question here. Is somebody save me? Yeah, you guys don't know where I'm going yet.
Well, the judge tells him what the Avengers did was meant to happen, but you escaping was not supposed to happen. And I get what you're saying. Like, it was meant to happen in the sense that in the one sacred timeline, they realize they screw up and they then decide to go back to the 1970s. Boy, we're spoiling Endgame. We're spoiling everything. If you're still watching and you haven't seen all these movies and there's any chance that you want to watch them all, leave, go away, go watch them all and then come back. Bookmark this, add it to your watch later list. You can come back. But anyway, in Endgame, that's when they decide to go back to 1970 and find an older version of the Tesseract, right? And all of that was meant to happen the way that it happened. And so in one sense, Loki was meant to abscond with the Tesseract, but in doing so, he created this alternate timeline, and that alternate timeline was fated to be, what do they call it? They call it. I'm losing all the terminology. They call it resetting him, but do they reset the timeline? They have the little bomb that they set off.
They prune the timeline.
Yeah, that variant timeline was destined to be pruned.
Okay, now I figured it out, and I apologize for my complete loss of mind there. But where we still have Loki being taken to a cell on Asgard. We still have him, the whole Thor 2 happening and his mother being killed, and that's part of the sacred timeline. And so here's the point I guess I'm making. I'm trying to wrap my brain around this idea that, okay, originally Loki doesn't pick up the Tesseract because they're not back in time and all that crazy stuff happening. Originally, he gets taken from there to Asgard. But then now that the Avengers have come back in time and they've, and Loki's ended up with the Tesseract and he's, jumped out of there. And here we have Mobius, named, I guess, after Mobius of the Mobius strip. Anyway, so Mobius presenting him with, this is what your future should look like. You should be back in Asgard, and you tell the elves to go the wrong way, and they kill your mother. But none of that has happened yet for Loki. How is that now going to happen? This is where I'm a little bit lost. Is it because after the Avengers are all done with everything, but they don't return the Tesseract to this spot, they return it to the 70s? So how does all of that eventually happen? Can someone help me out on that?
It won't happen to this Loki. This Loki is now a variant Loki. He has forked himself off of the main timeline. So none of that stuff will happen to this Loki. It happens to the original Loki. So basically the timeline that was created by the Avengers landing in 2012 and screwing up and not being able to get the Tesseract, that timeline has been reset. The TVA stepped out of their little amber colored portal and they set off a little bomb that reset that timeline. That timeline no longer exists. The Avengers basically, they did land there. They did do all that stuff. But then after they left, and presumably just a few minutes after they left, right? Loki ends up in the desert somewhere and the TVA steps through and they reset that, they prune that alternate timeline.
Okay.
So that timeline no longer exists. But Loki
I appreciate that. I didn't get that. You're saying
the variant version of Loki stepped out of that timeline before it got pruned, and now he exists as.
Okay, see, and that's what I needed because of my understanding. Yeah, I thought that when Loki appears,
and evidently, now we won't know, and now I'm spoiling the end of this episode. So if you're still watching, please go away. But at the end of this episode, we find out that Loki is the villain that they're also tracking, a different variant of Loki. So evidently Loki's done this before, or he will do it again in the future. He will step out of his timeline. Maybe he's done it hundreds of times.
It appears that he's collecting these reset buttons, bombs, which are the greatest weapon we've seen in the Marvel universe. They destroy
use them to reset
universes.
whole timelines. Universes.
Yeah, so we have the TVA going around and completely destroying universes, killing everyone in them, far worse than anything Thanos ever did.
Yeah.
Preserve the sacred timeline and to keep things straight and to keep the timelines from warring against each other. It's much better to just destroy and kill all of the other universes that spring up.
So I won't be surprised at all to find out at the end of this that the TVA all along has been the villains, but I don't think that's where they're going with this. They seem to be setting up the TVA as these are the good guys, right? They're the guys that said what the Avengers did was supposed to happen, right? That the 1 out of 4 billion different timelines that Doctor Strange looked ahead and saw, the one that he saw where they won, that is the sacred timeline, it turns out, right? And so the TVA has been on the Avengers side all along, helping all things to be funneled to that 1 in 4 billion timeline, right? So I think the TVA are the good guys. Well, so and I like that personally because believing as I do in there is one, I believe there's one sacred timeline, right? I don't think that God prunes all of these other variant timelines. I don't think God is omnipotent and omniscient. I don't think there is even such a thing as alternate timelines that are constantly being pruned by God. And so I find that interesting that like these timekeepers are supposed to be all knowing, but all these mistakes are happening constantly and they're having to constantly sort of like herding cats, shepherding all of these broken timelines, and getting rid of them. And I don't think that's how it works at all, because I think that God is truly omniscient and omnipotent. He doesn't allow that. But this is very similar to like, we call it middle knowledge or Molinism, which is not a philosophy that I ascribe to, but it's the idea that God kind of knows the space, the conceptual space of like all of the possible timelines, and he just picks one of them to be the best one, and there's a sense in there where all of these timelines do exist in some conceptual space outside of the mind of God, and it's a little bit like a pre-existence, like all this stuff, and the idea is to try to smuggle a version of free will, in through the back door, kind of, right? And this is kind of that idea of like there's a million possible timelines, and these all-knowing timekeepers are getting rid of all of them but the one that they want to keep, right? But that's very different from my understanding of a truly omnipotent God who decrees this is the right timeline, this is what I will create, right?
Well, I found a pretty good quote from Tom Hiddleston, who is Loki, when he said he was preparing for the role, because he said, I had to ask myself, because obviously it has religious overtones, but he's like, well, who gave the timekeepers the authority to discern the sacred timeline? He says, can we trust the TVA? They have defined themselves as benevolent guardians of a tidy timeline, and if ever there's a branch that they think isn't quite right, they could prune it. But is that also taking people's choice and agency away? Who gets to make those determinations? And so that's where our divide would lie here, is like, well, is it ultimately up to God, or should we have some say in that? And Brent, like I was going to mention Molinism too. It seems like they're doing some version of that, but they're pulling all sorts. I mean, this is a multiverse theory, which is actually kind of one of the theories. I'm not sure. There's lots of versions of it, but basically they're saying, as opposed to middle knowledge or Molinism, where God is conceptually seeing all of the possible universes that could come from every possible choice anyone can ever make. He's like, he can see all the branches, if you will, but then he chooses which one to actuate, and that's the chosen timeline. They're saying, and this is kind of a sci-fi theory too, but they're saying every single universe that can be actual, meaning can exist, does or could exist in some branch, but only one is the pure good one that God or the TVA would want to keep. And so in doing so,
the three timekeepers of the Holy Trinity or something. Anyway.
Oh, that's an interesting. Now, so the last time we talked about this free will versus determinism, I'm drawing a blank on his name now. our atheist friend. Daniel. Why couldn't I? Yeah. Daniel. He brought up the guy who does these lectures where he, in real time, right in a lecture, he runs a website that shoots a particle at something and which is supposed to be like cause a split in the timeline, right? And then he decides beforehand, I'm either going to step to the left or I'm going to step to the right. You know, presumably every time he does that presentation, he's in the universe in which he stepped the right way, nothing happens and life goes on. But the universe in which he stepped the wrong way, the TVA comes flying out of their portals and immediately resets that one. Right.
And yeah, this is why, you know, so we have this world where the idea is that if there's this truly randomness going on in the universe, this is what we talked about with Daniel, I believe, that if there is something truly random, that it requires something truly random, like the splitting or the spinning of quantum particles or whatever, that's the only way that there could be some actual, free will in the universe. And the way that Daniel, I believe, accounts for that is by saying, but it isn't truly random because every possible scenario is creating a new universe. There's no randomness to it. It's all just everything's happening. And so then the question is, well, after quote unquote, everything is happening and all possible universes are being made, if there were a God, a triumvirate, timekeepers council deciding on a sacred timeline, and they sent the TVA in and pruned every single one but the sacred one, do we return to a place now of some kind of agency in that, or are we still in a complete deterministic world, only now it's being determined both by all the possibilities coming to pass and by a God who is forcing the sacred timeline? We have both religion and science now, I think, in the Loki universe agreeing on some kind of determinism world. Jake, I haven't heard much from you. What are all your thoughts on all of this?
Sure. Yeah. So when when that little video came on, right when Loki's waiting in like the before place before he goes in for his trial, and that it's just explaining things, I think the sacred timeline isn't as minuscule as like I meant to step left or I'm meant to step right now. It seemed like the timeline there was a little thicker, and it's like, well, there's some variance that can happen in here. Right. But it's when you become like an extreme variant where you go outside and it has a big enough impact on something, that's when they have to step in and prune it. And so I guess the connotation of that is that, what Loki did, him not eventually going and dying there, but escaping and something like that would have a really big impact. So just an immediate thought there. I also wanted to make sure, Steve, that you pointed out there's 3 timekeepers. I was like, well, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go further on the, Steve, looks like you had something you wanted to interject.
Well, I just wanted to jump in real quick and clarify, because I don't know that it got clarified from earlier where I had that complete confusion about what was going on. I really appreciate Joey clarifying that for me. When Loki picked up the Tesseract and found himself in Mongolia, jumps up on a rock and tries to be God to these people. And then, I thought that he had, from the place where he picked up the Tesseract, moved into a completely different universe. But no, we're saying the whole universe split off at the point he kind of picked up the Tesseract, and he had just moved to a different part of the world in that universe. And that, yeah, everybody in that universe is destroyed when they set off the reset charge. And
yeah, when he was in the desert, he literally just went around the world to some other part of the world.
He only teleported. He didn't go through time anywhere. Yeah,
or through dimensions. He didn't transport himself to a different dimension, or
that's what I thought he had, and so I thought they had just destroyed this little dimension that all we'd ever seen of that dimension was Mongolia.
Was the desert?
No, they destroyed the whole split off from where he picked up the Tesseract, including the Avengers battle that was going on in New York at the time. It was all destroyed, and that makes more sense to me. So now when he says, "I can't go back, can I?" Because it's all gone.
Yeah, they
and
that timeline.
Yeah, so the other timeline where he never picked up the Tesseract kept going, and yet the Avengers jumped to the 70s. Anyway, okay, sorry.
So the more religious overtones. I found the murals in the courtroom, those reminded me so much of like murals in the temple, or like if you've ever been in a Catholic cathedral where they have the 12 stations of the cross, on the 2 sides of the sanctuary, right?
One side we had the humans doing. we had the humanoid TVA people doing their religious work. And on the other side, we had the
timekeepers pruning the timeline.
Pruning the tree of life, the timeline. Yeah, exactly. I totally, so religious.
And what was the other religious icon imagery that I noticed? Shoot. There was one other thing.
Yeah, it'll come back to you. But I mean, well, they're back in France. When they go back, they go to a church, right? And of course, Loki is.
Oh yeah. The devil. Loki's the devil.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's the Nordic
and
devil.
He wants to destroy the sacred timeline, right? Evidently, this whatever variant of him that's stealing all the time bombs, the reset bombs, he wants to destroy the sacred timeline, probably.
Yeah. Here's a quick question: Is he trying to collect all of the reset charges so that he can have the power to destroy things, or is he trying to restore? Has he suddenly realized there's determinism and he's trying to give everybody agency again?
Right. This is a difference between your worldview and my worldview, right? In your worldview, God is the one who wants to give everyone agency, and Satan wants to take it all away and make one perfect timeline. And in mine, it's the opposite. God is making this one perfect timeline, and Satan wants to destroy it. He wants to create chaos. He wants to create this multiverse, right? So this show is lining up a lot more with my philosophy, but like I said at the outset, I'm fully prepared for it to go in a completely different direction.
From the beginning, it's taking a stance that there is a deterministic world, and that we have the Godhead, the timekeepers, trying to they know the sacred timeline, and then the rest of the TVA surfs that sacred timeline. It is kind of interesting then, because the kinds of questions you ask someone who believes in determinism come up in the show, like when he says, "I can't believe you were D.B. Cooper," which I don't know if any of you then went out and did the research on.
I had to go Wikipedia. Yeah.
Everybody suddenly now has to learn what is this D.B. Cooper, because we all are too young to know. But and so then he says, "Oh, you guys were all in favor of that, and you're in favor of the timekeepers approve of me stealing that money," and then he answers back, "Well, it's not so much approve or disapprove. It's just this is the timeline." I
thought that was interesting. Are they omnibenevolent or not? Right? They're yeah, that's interesting. They're letting lots of bad stuff happen because
is it good because this goes back to that question of, is it good because they say it is, or is it good because it's good?
Yeah.
And in this case, it's kind of just good because they say it is.
Yeah, they determine what's good. They're like, yeah, whatever. We control the time.
As long as it results in the sacred timeline continuing, and that's the idea of like the best of all possible worlds, right? That even in the best of all possible worlds, there's a bunch of bad things that happen, but because no matter which of the universes in the multiverse you pick, bad things happen in all of them, and so it's about finding the one where you find the maximal good happens or whatever, but some of my favorite lines, I loved all the stuff where they were in that one little room watching his life on the TV, and because at one point he says, well, this was interesting to me. He keeps reiterating that he's a god. He wants to talk to the timekeepers, gods to gods. At one point he says to Mobius, I do whatever I want because I'm a god, And I thought that was so interesting because true libertarian free will, I think, makes you a god, And so the idea in the Latter-day Saint worldview that you are all gods in embryo, or the crass way to put it is like the same species as God, I think that's 1,000,000% consistent with a libertarian free will. All these other versions of libertarian free will, like Molinism, middle knowledge, where they smuggle it in through the back door, right? They still want to say that God is the only God and we're all creatures of God, but then they try to smuggle free will somehow in through the back door. I think all of those projects, all those experiments are doomed to fail. You can't come up with a consistent philosophy where you do have libertarian free will and you're not a God, because that makes you a god. If you are in control of your own fate, your own destiny, you are a god, And so I guess I'm showing you guys respect here in saying that, like, I think your worldview is very consistent on that front. I disagree with it. It's not my worldview, but I find it remarkably consistent. And I love here, Loki's like, no, you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to do whatever I want because I'm a god, And it's appropriate for him to say that, at least he thinks, right? But I I love how Mobius is just like, yeah, sure, you're gonna do whatever you want, right? Like time when he tries to stand up from the chair, and Mobius immediately time twists him back into the chair, and he goes, I was just gonna stand up and make a point, and Mobius says, oh, okay, well, go ahead, and he says, no, it's lost its meaning now. If I stand up, it's not gonna be the same. And he's like, well, okay, fine, then sit down, and Loki's like, no, I'm gonna do whatever I want to do, and he stands up, and Mobius just goes, sure, yeah, okay, whatever. I love that, because it's like Loki is like still in denial. He still thinks that he's in control of all of what he's doing, and really he's not. He hasn't quite caught on yet to what's going on. And I thought all of that was brilliant. It's played so well by Tom Hiddleston and Owen Wilson. They just, the chemistry between those two and the banter, it's brilliant. I love it. I'm here for it, all of it.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting when they were sitting there and Loki, right? Like you said, he keeps on saying, I'm a god. And when he was on the earth, he had powers, but suddenly he gets up to the realm of the timekeepers, right? A sacred realm. Suddenly his powers don't mean anything. I'm a god. He's like, yeah, but that doesn't really, like, not so much here.
Yeah.
And then, right, more of those relations to him being the devil, right? No, like, your purpose was so that you could test everyone else and make them their best possible selves. And it shows the Avengers as like, they wouldn't have become who they were without it. Right? Very interesting take on the devil. Obviously, right, in a creator creature, like the devil, isn't that someone that God would have create?
Yep, he's got the devil on a short leash. Yeah, the devil is not there. There's this I think it's called like dualism, where God and the devil are like locked in this eternal battle, and they both keep getting one up on each other. That is not at all how I see God. Is the one who's omniscient and omnipotent, and the devil is a creature. And so God is 100% always in control of Satan. And this is honestly one of the most difficult aspects of Calvinism, the kind of predeterminism that I believe in, right? Is that there are creatures that God creates whose purpose is to, just like how Mobius described Loki in the show. And I will even admit to feeling some difficulty about that idea, that there are some people who are just destined for hell, and it's just the way it is.
By design.
So I'm sure the movie I'm sure the show is going to give this version of Loki some kind of redemptive arc, right? And he's going to turn out to not be what he's destined to be, but we'll see.
Well, and that they showed him that too, right? They showed him in fact, he mentions, I am burdened with glorious purpose when he gets up on the rock to talk to the Mongolians. And then that phrase comes back when he laughs after he's been killed by Thanos, and he looks at himself and he goes, glorious purpose. And yet
she asks him, what's so funny? And he says, glorious purpose. Yeah.
I think he did realize that in this life that he thought he had been given the glorious purpose to be king of Midgard and king of the 9 Asgard and the 9 realms, that then he sees his glorious purpose. And at first, I think it strikes him as terribly without purpose. But I also think he kind of senses there is a purpose. And, and I've read another article that I don't have in front of me, but an article where the directors of this episode say that scene where he watches himself and his life and his death at the hands of Thanos, and it was inspired by the Toy Story scene where Buzz Lightyear sees his commercial and realizes you are a toy, and we've had this discussion around religion too, right? Because this idea that where we in our religious philosophy, and my brother Dave and I like to argue a little bit there with you, Joey, and say, but your religion and this Calvinism essentially relegates us to being toys. And we look at it, and we're a toy, we're God's toys, we're his playthings, and that's what Loki seems to be realizing in that same moment, is that like Buzz Lightyear, he's a toy. Any thoughts on that moment? Because that's a pretty intense moment.
Well, I mean, at least maybe not directly on that of the episode, but that spurs to mind of just one of my main critiques is that of determinism is just, especially like in the religious sense of like, we're not merely toys. It's not like Toy Story where we have free will, but then someone comes and controls our hands and arms. We don't exist as individuals. We aren't things. We are figments of, for an analogy, where as if, you know, when you go to sleep at night and you dream and you have this story and you can control all of the characters and what they do and everything like that, and they exist in this universe you created in your mind, but you actually are in control of all of them. They don't exist. There is no reality to them. They are merely you manifesting itself in this drama that you're putting on. And so that's kind of the thing that turns me off the most about determinism, is that. And I want to say two more things. One's related to that, one's kind of not, but I just wanted to clarify too that libertarianism doesn't necessarily mean we have free will to do everything and anything we want. It's not like I want to be a fridge and then suddenly I'm a fridge, right? So it's a limit, like within the limited possibilities that are now possible, given all of the past that has happened up to this point and the potential futures, I have a very limited amount of free will to what I can actually do, but the choice is free, as in I'm not going to have to pick one. I may be more likely, like statistically speaking, to pick one than not, but I still ultimately can make a different choice. And then third, I just want to point this out up front. Like the thing about this that, you know, you can talk about is I reject the whole premise of the B theory of time. So there's two theories of time, and one of them actually I think kind of entails determinism, which is the B theory of time. And that's that all times exist, like really, like the past still exists that you can go and travel to, right? Or the future exists already. And so the thing is, if the future already exists as an actual thing, then it is written. It can't diverge. Like even the paradox of this time travel is that, well, that can't be the case because it's already been the case, but that's not the case. Therefore, if you travel back from a future event and then try to change that, I mean, I guess they address it in that it breaks the universe, but then you wouldn't exist to come back in time to do that. Therefore, it's just this paradox that they deal with in every time travel movie, where ultimately it's a logical paradox that just can't sustain itself. But that's only, and then I guess I didn't articulate. So the A theory of time, which is the one that I think you have to take if you take on any kind of actual free will, is that only now exists. And you have to, you know, take into account, you know, now can mean a lot of different things for the universe, because time is a little tricky and it travels at different rates for different gravitational areas of the universe and all that. But regardless of the different, you know, the different measures of time, they are all happening now. And there was a before and an after, and that before is gone and the after has not yet been. And therefore, I think that's required to have any sort of free will. Whereas if we accept that you could time travel, I think you have to accept determinism in some way. And rant.
Thank you. That's great. I want to make a few more comments, or to bring out a few more lines from the episode that we haven't yet addressed. I love the part where when Loki's going into through the process of being inducted into the TVA area, and first of all, of course, they present with him with every word he's ever spoken, which indicates that, okay, this organization is keeping track of everything, right? But secondly, when they say, please confirm to your knowledge that you are not a fully robotic being, and that you were born as an organic creature and do in fact possess what many cultures would call a soul. And of course, he pauses for a second and says, what if I was a robot and I didn't know it?
Do a lot of people not know that they're robots?
Thank you for
love it, because it's
and just by asking the question, the other guy takes that as confirmation. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it? It's this. Yeah, I think, therefore I am, and also these moments reminded me immediately of another TV show that had a lot to do with religion that maybe we should talk about, which was The Good Place, right? And so as he's inducted through this system, and they ask him those kinds of questions, and I'm like, oh, there's that philosophical argument, and not only did it remind me of The Good Place, but the guy Casey, who he threatens gutting him with a fish, is in The Good Place. So in the moment too, when I saw him, he's Pillboy in The Good Place, and so I thought, oh, there we go. It reminds me of that. But anyway,
so going to that metal detector, right? And he was like, "What if I really am a robot? What's going to happen?" He's like, "Oh, you'll be melted from the inside out." And he's starting to doubt himself, and I was like, well, there's that chance I could be.
Exactly, which is something that, again, these are the things of, if there is a God, if there are multiple universes, if we're all actually robots. Another religious show got a lot of heavy religion in it is the space one. Sorry, the one written by a Latter-day Saint author in the 70s. What?
Battlestar Galactica.
Battlestar Galactica, yes, and that's the whole premise behind that. Again, spoilers: if you haven't watched Battlestar Galactica and you want to go and get in there, you know. But the idea that people are robots and they don't realize it, you know, and yeah, are we robots? Are we children of God? Are we in one of many multiverses? We just can't know the answer. Like, really scientifically know the answer to these questions. And so to have them tossed out in the middle of a TV show is a lot of fun, right? The sign in the background when he's going through the take a ticket scene, and and the other person didn't take a ticket, and so he gets reset or whatever in that moment. And there's a sign that just says 0 tolerance in the background. And the guy who is behind the screen it doesn't even faze him that somebody just got reset right in front of him. This idea that, you know, religion, there's a lot of comments on religion, you know, and another one would be where he says, you know, bureaucrats will not dictate how my story ends. And she says, it's not your story. It never was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
he's not the main character, right? Thor is the main character in all of the Thor movies, and Loki is a supporting character, right? It's not his story, and I think that's a very, so we mentioned a second ago, you know, the idea that I was going to say this very same thing earlier when Corey was saying something. Now I'm forgetting. I'm drawing a blank on exactly what you were saying, but it is a very humbling idea to believe that. Oh, you were talking about whether we're toys or not, or whether we're actors on a stage, you know, whether we just exist in some kind of dream that God is having or whatever. And I've had to kind of come to grips with all of those ideas. Maybe that's exactly what's going on. And it's very humbling to think that I'm not the main character of my story. God is the main character. And really, Jesus is the main character of this story. And all of the rest of us are all supporting cast members. We're, you know, some of us are the villains, some of us are the best friends of the main character, but we're not the main character. And it's a very different worldview from a worldview where you think that I'm a god, I'm the main character in my story, right? I'm going to go on to do greater things, and this life is a stepping stone toward that. You know, these are very incompatible worldviews, very different ideas. And so it is, yeah, for her to say to him, "You're not. This isn't your story," and it never was. You know. That was a very interesting line, philosophically.
And I just, at least for my position, like, I think, because that's Mormonism does, at least certain strands of it tend to go in that direction of like, well, you know, God is our father. Like, you know, you take him as like a literal father, and then what do you do with your father? Well, you grow up and you get your own thing, and then
you get out from under your father's shadow,
and you make your own thing. But in my, you know, that's actually, you know, probably what I believe for a long time. But, and, you know, forgive me for being influenced by my dad's books. But my dad, who's has his books and stuff, you know, we talk about a bunch. If you haven't heard about it, oh well, I'm just gonna assume you know. Anyway,
Corey, so get out from under your father here. Grow up.
I'm trying, right? I know, I need to, but I like one of his, at least the way he articulates a different take on that aspect of Mormonism, where it's saying, well, rather than getting out from under God or being like a child and a parent, and then having your dad be like, you know, a good buddy, good pal. Maybe, you know, there is some aspect of that, though. In Mormonism, God is looking for a peer relationship, meaning he's not just looking for creatures, he's looking for true friends, for companions, for that. But the aspect that I wanted to point out is that we aren't, in at least my dad's philosophy, we're not God's independent from God. No one's independent from God. There, you have to, it's kind of weird, but it's like you join in with the Godhead rather than you go create your own Godhead. And the way he defines it, and again, this is probably, you know, debatable, obviously, but is that Godhood only arises in a certain type of relationship, the type, for example, that the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost share, and the one that Jesus invites and pleads with the Father to let all of his apostles enter into in John 17, where it says, I pray that they may be one as we are one. And in that oneness, divinity is what do you call it? Emergent, whereas you don't have divinity on your own, but it comes as a result of the unification of you and God. And my dad has this analogy that he hits so many times it got a little nauseating almost in the podcast, but of a molecule of water, where it's like, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen aren't water, and they never will be by themselves, and they can't have those properties in and of themselves, meaning they're like, I'm divine. If I just stay around long enough, I'll eventually become God. It's like, no, it's not like that. It's that once you join in this unifying thing, from that, just the way water emerges and it creates a completely new thing from those molecules, that's his view of divinity. And I like that. I have a lot of critiques of some of his views, but that part, I think I like it. So I'm just bringing that around to this, saying like, you're not God on your own, like Loki's out there like, I just do what I want because I'm a God and I can do whatever I want. It's more like, no, like you're still dependent in a way on God, but then on everyone. And that's what Mormonism not ultimately, but at least a strong strand of Zion unification is.
Yeah, if we are going to end up as children of God and become like him or like the timekeepers, we kind of have to align our will with them, and we all have to go down the same sacred timeline. And so does that in fact remove our agency or not? Or are we choosing into that, right? And that's where our agency is. And I've said before in previous videos, I feel like if there's agency, potentially the only bit of agency I have is to decide, will I align myself with God or will I not? And he lets me decide that. He doesn't control me to do it. So anyway, Joey, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was just to say, I will apologize for the unfair characterization of your worldview as like, oh, I'm gonna step out and be the main character. You're more of a main character than I am in my worldview, but I get exactly what you're saying, that you're never going to be the main character or stand on your own as the only main character, right? And so I would just say, like, the way that I just mischaracterized your views, I would say, like, the way that my father talks about my worldview is he likes to say that we are all shrimp. And I think that's an unfair characterization of my worldview. And I think talking about us as toys, that we're just God's playthings, I think that's an unfair characterization. I think we're more than that to God. I think we have more worth to God than that. But so really what it is the unfair characterizations are out here, right? And the reality is kind of closer to here. There's still a difference in our worldview, a huge difference, right? But it's easy to reach for the unfair characterizations that are further out, But anyway,
yours is not a totally unfair characterization. Like I said, this is a nuanced view within Mormonism, and the
one
you characterize definitely exists.
I would say the same about we're all just God's playthings. It's not a totally unfair character. It's not where I would go, but I can see how you got there from what I'm, how I'm describing my worldview. So,
Jake, do you have some thoughts?
Maybe just talking about the sacred timeline and how that relates to religion, or at least from the LDS point of view, or more specifically from my point of view, right? Because it's interesting. Again, to me, it seemed like there was more latitude inside of a sacred timeline that people can act, but when they go past a certain point, that's when they get cut off. I think it's flip-flopped on whose sacred timeline it is, though. Like, I don't think God is saying, like, this is the one sacred timeline. And this kind of goes to all of us being the own main character in our story, but like we're all actually trying to come together as, it's almost like we're all playing an MMORPG, right? One of those online, like there's no one person, we're all coming into play together, and only coming together can we make something bigger than just the one of us. And so it's more of, there's a sacred timeline, but it's not us that are being governed. It's God has certain things that he knows will happen because he's going to make them happen. But other than that, it's like he's going to let the timeline do what it does, with only him stepping in to make sure certain things happen. Not everything needs to happen this way, and if anything steps off of that, I prune it. And so I think, at least in LDS view, there's a lot less pruning. That there is some pruning, I think, that happens with God stepping in when it needs to happen to ensure that His purpose is made to be.
That's good.
Yeah, real fast. I have another thing that this brought to mind, especially, and this has always been in the back of my mind with a lot of any discussion of like Mormonism and determinism or just free will in general. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, but it's a pretty cool parallel. Okay, well, basically, there's this math genius guy, and he does this thing called, it doesn't matter, but anyway, he has a super math thing that he can't determine individual actions, but taken on the whole, if he takes all of the information that he has with this certain like algorithm he discovers, he can determine what on the whole all of society is going to be. And he sees that in 500 years his civilization is going to cease to exist because of various reasons. So he determines what it would take to change that, and then so he calculates this all out, and then he creates I guess they're basically recordings of where he's going to come and intervene if it gets too far off of the path. So basically they're going on this path in the timeline, and they're like, whoa, we're sticking to what he says. He almost becomes like a religious figure to them. But then every book this happens, because that's just like how they do it. But they always have some crisis that happens, which is not accounted for because there's some variance that he can't know on the individual level. But then he has calculated something, or I don't remember exactly, but then he comes and he makes this appearance, and he himself, the mathematician from like almost a couple hundred years ago now, has a holographic thing, and he tells them some little bit of information or corrective that they need to take, and then they do that, and then they're back on the timeline, and then another few hundred years passes, and then that happens again, and he keeps going. And I always thought of not exactly, obviously it's a metaphor and all metaphors break down, but like I think that's kind of my view of the way that God acts while still doing, because like I said, there's a certain level of determinism. Maybe I can't ever use the word determinism without it being a loaded term, but obviously there's certain things that are very, very so probable to happen that they're going to happen given the events of the past. They're almost a given, in fact. But within that, there's certain variations. But I would say maybe God doesn't have foreknowledge per se, but he has enough knowledge to determine kind of what can happen. But he, like Jake said, he has a goal in mind in the end. And he's like, well, I'm going to do what it takes to get this goal. And unlike, his name is Harry Seldon, unlike the Isaac Asimov guy, he's not dead, he's active. And so he can see if things are going off of his ultimate goal, and he can come and make correctives. That doesn't mean he's forcing, well, I don't know, maybe he's forcing it. That's where maybe it breaks it down. But he can come in and intervene at various points in history more overtly, because I would say God's always present, but more overt things, because you're like, man, in the Old Testament he seemed to do huge things, and maybe now he does, we just don't know. But anyway, I think it's related to the timeline staying pure, but in a way that still maintains free will to a degree with God in there.
I think that, now I could be wrong about this, I just have kind of a hunch that if you were to line up movies that go heavily in a religious philosophical direction, especially in Hollywood today, that you would find that most of them don't align themselves with deterministic Calvinistic principles, that most of them tend to align themselves with choose your own story. Your future's not written. You can do whatever you would like. And so that being the case, I'm guessing, like Joey said at the beginning of our discussion here, that there's a decent chance that that's the direction this will eventually turn, because that just seems to be the favorite philosophical view of Hollywood, is this idea that actually everything we showed you in the first episode where everything was determined was just a ruse. And that now we actually think that your future's not written and you can decide.
It's already there, right? You talked about the A theory of time and the B theory of time. Clearly, this is still an A theory of time, right? There's just these all-knowing, creatures at the top that are pruning it all, but there's still every possibility that this could just go sideways really fast. They've been able to maintain this control for how many millennia, but
Not because they're destined to, or it's the only way it can go, but simply because they've taken so much control and power that somebody can unseat them.
But we know where this is going. If you're aware of some of the properties, some of the IP that's like in the hopper right now for the next 2 or 3 years of the MCU, you know this is going to go sideways, right? And whether it goes sideways in this series, probably, right, or whether it goes sideways in some of the later movies or whatever, it's gonna go sideways.
So what I think is interesting is that as they're presenting this idea right now in this first episode of, look, this is just the way it is. There's these 3 timekeepers and they keep everything in line, and we're all determined to do exactly what we're supposed to do.
They've been maintaining the illusion of a B theory of time. All, you know, like
exactly. And the question comes up. I think they give us some rote standard answers for those who want to argue against determinism and Calvinism or whatever, that I just want to read through. And I guess, Joey, since you're the most deterministic here of the bunch here, do you, feel like these are kinds of the answers that your side of this equation has said in the past? Things like when they say, look, the TVA doesn't exactly know, or doesn't just know your whole past, and we know your whole life and how it's all meant to be. And they just think of it as comforting. Like, is that, a response that you might get from a Calvinist or a deterministic person? Isn't it so comforting to know that it's just set and it can't change? And
I do see it as a pastoral doctrine. And honestly, like when he was showing the Avengers on the screen, and telling Loki that like the only reason you exist is so that other people can become the best versions of themselves, right? And the idea that what the Avengers did in Endgame was meant to happen, and what you did by escaping was not supposed to happen, right? I find that comforting, that the timekeepers are there to make sure that the MCU is going the right direction, that the good guys are always going to win, that it's the 1 out of 4 million different timelines that Doctor Strange saw, that if the timekeepers must have had something to do with the rat that stepped on the right button in the quantum tunnel ban. They've been at the top, like directing all things, and I do find that comforting. Here's the subtext. Here's the meta, right? Is that the directors, right? The Russo brothers were the timekeepers who made sure that Infinity War and Endgame turned out the way they were meant to turn out. And that's the there's Kevin Feige is the timekeeper, right? He's the guy at the top making sure that the MCU goes where it's supposed to go. So, and
at least in this universe, there's certainly timekeepers. The question is, can we trust Kevin Feige? Can we trust the timekeepers? Can we trust God? Is it really the best way? Is it really the sacred timeline, or is it just their choice, right?
So far, Kevin Feige's done an excellent job. It could go sideways, Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So another quote. Go ahead.
I was gonna say one other major critique though of that view. I'd like, because I agree. Like, there's a certain comfort in that view of like, well, and it is, like you said, it's pastoral. Like, it's a solution to the problem of evil, or trying to be, saying bad things are happening. But if we now tell ourselves, if the story is that actually all the bad things were part of this grand plan of God's, and everything is actually meant to be that way, anything that happens to you is supposed to happen to you, there's nothing more possibly comforting. Like, anything that I am doing is what I'm supposed to be doing. Anything I don't do, anything I didn't accomplish, any dream I didn't pursue, I wasn't supposed to pursue it. Otherwise, God would have made me do it. And so, but there's
Loki gives the great. There's the great answer to that, right?
Well, he is, but there's the one side was like, there's the comfort, but then there's the other problem that people are critiquing a lot, especially in the last few years, with like all the instances, like, oh, thoughts and prayers. Like, the problem with Christianity is people are, instead of going out and helping people, saying thoughts and prayers and sitting on their butts instead of actually going and helping people.
Right. So the one problem with this idea of whether it's comforting or not to know that God is in control and that everything is happening according to his method comes up when, you ask, how could the timekeepers let Phil Coulson, such a wonderful man, die? And he says, well, didn't the Avengers actually come together to literally avenge him by defeating you? That's why. That's how. And Loki gives the best answer, right? Little solace to a dead man, little solace to to, you know, we said at one point that, or Daniel says that the Holocaust comes up in these kinds of discussions or whatever. Little solace to all those who died in the Holocaust to know that didn't the Allies and everybody come together to say this would never happen again? You know, little solace to all those people, right? Little solace to all the people who got damned to hell for eternity simply because he wanted to show his glory. Little solace to them.
So,
right?
All the other ones, the Holocaust and all of that can all be forgiven because those people will end up in heaven or whatever.
Say, right? Yeah, Christianity has the answer for that.
The real one is little solace to the ones who end up in hell. And I read a book called, so there was this thing a decade ago, Young, Restless, and Reformed. And there's this guy who wrote a book, Young, Restless, and No Longer Reformed. And his main criticism of Reformed, the Calvinist worldview was, what about all the people who are predestined to go to hell? You know, there's nothing, you know, and it's a criticism. You know, I don't have good answers for it. You know, it's a difficult problem. I think I don't know. There are answers, and I think Scripture is very plain. You know, so if you're going to take umbrage with the doctrine, you have to take umbrage with the Scripture that I think very clearly teaches the doctrine. But
well, so I want to wrap this up with two final quotes from this Loki episode that that might give us a hint into the direction that they're going, as we've been talking about. But the first one here, well, this less so a hint, but more so a comment on religion, right? There's this quote where at first Loki gets up and he says, I know what's going on here about the TVA and the timekeepers and everything. It's the cruel, elaborate trick conjured by the weak to inspire fear, a desperate play for control. And then later he realizes that that's what he does and why he takes advantage of and hurts people is to play a cruel, elaborate trick conjured by himself, the weak, to inspire fear, a desperate play for control. The funny thing is, you know, this could be a comment against all religion, right? Religion is just a cruel, elaborate trick, right? Conjured by the weak to inspire fear in the masses, a desperate play for control. And it's all, and so I think that's a comment on religion, but it's also a comment on all of us. Don't we all go about from time to time in our life trying to inspire fear in those around us? Unfortunately, our family members and our friends sometimes, as a desperate play for control. We kind of desperately want control in our own lives. We want to know that we're in charge of our own lives. We make our own decisions. And because we don't always feel like we're in control, we reach out with this, you know, desperate play for control and this fear. And as this show today, this episode tries to point out, we're not in control, you know? So that's an interesting thought that I wanted to point out. And then the last thing is that, as we've already said, it doesn't appear truly like there is just a set destiny and sacred timeline that is ruling. Like, again, this is the question of, are the timekeepers determining the timeline, or does the timeline determine what the timekeepers do? Do the timekeepers live outside of the sacred timeline? You know, or are they acting the way that they are acting because that is the sacred timeline and how it's determined? And the one thing that indicated
are
so
the
far
things that are going on
in
this TV show, which are ostensibly outside of the timeline, is that part of the sacred timeline, or are these things all happening outside?
Exactly. The whole TVA, the fact that where Mobius is arguing with whatever her name 15 is, the woman, where she says talking to that variant is a mistake. And he says, that's your position. Wait, what? Wait, they can have different positions? I thought there's
she comes in and interrupts,
timeline.
and she says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm doing my job. What is your job? To interrupt me? And maybe it is, right? Maybe her job in that moment, according to the sacred timeline, was to come in and interrupt him because they needed Loki to actually use the time twister and they needed him to see all the Infinity Stones in the drawer so that he would finally come to grips with, like, oh crap, I'm dealing with a higher power here, you know. And that was all predetermined. That was all that was their plan. They coerced him into finally, you know,
and then he sees the rest of his life, and then he takes a moment to really get control of her and move her forward and backward in time and realize there's a little bit of a realization of this is kind of stupid, you know. That if I could just control everybody like this and make them do whatever I wanted, I'm not sure that it would give him the pleasure that he thought he was going to have, you know. But anyway, my point is that one line where Mobius says to her, well, that's your position. And the question then comes up, well, who's following the sacred timeline? Why can't we just check the timeline?
Right.
Don't we know?
And then she instructs the guys to reset him on site, and Mobius is like, no resetting, no, they disagreed. Yeah. And it's like, well, can they disagree? Can people in the team, because they're all trying to carry out the will of the timekeepers, right? Shouldn't they all be in one voice, unanimous?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There shouldn't be any disagreement if we're following the sacred timeline.
I caught all of that, and I agree with you, Steve. I think all of that's a ruse. I think all of that is part of, they're playing Loki like a fiddle. They're putting him right, they're funneling him right where they want him. He thinks he's in control. He thinks he's the one making all the choices and taking all the initiative, and they're playing him like a fiddle. But here's my theory about the very end, because he does. He plays around with her, with the time twister for a minute, but then when Mobius walks back into the room, Loki's sitting on the ground, and that's when he finally admits, like, he seems defeated, right? He's like, I can't go back, can I? I can't go back to my timeline, and he admits to Mobius, I don't like hurting people. It's just what I'm supposed to do, Here's what I think, and this is what I love about Loki. It's the same thing that I love about the Batman animated series. Batman was always a step ahead, right? And even in the moments when you thought that Batman had been caught or defeated or whatever, he would always come out and reveal that, oh, actually, I knew all along what was going on, and I've been playing you like a fiddle, right? I think that Loki has a plan, and that's why he laughs. He laughs, and the lady asks him, what do you laugh about, or what's so funny? He goes, glorious purpose. I think he's got a new glorious purpose. He's figured it. He saw his own death, and that gave him a new glorious purpose. And so when he's sitting on the floor acting all defeated, I think that's an act. He has now taken back all the control. And now he's playing Mobius, or at least he thinks he is. But I think Mobius is still playing him. I think Mobius knows that Loki thinks he's playing Mobius. And they're both a step ahead of each other is what's happening. And it is getting very complicated.
Truly, Loki you have a dizzying intellect.
He fakes his death many times, right? And then every time you think he's dead, nope, he's not really dead. That was an act the whole time, right? I think in this moment at the last part of this episode where he's finally acting like, oh, I see what's going on here. You guys really are the power here, I think that's an act. I think at that moment,
well, eventually
he's got a new purpose.
Some version of him has to head off on this track that's collecting all of the destructive things. And like I say, I think maybe he's going to try to destroy the timekeepers in the TVA, or something, give everybody back their freedom. I don't know. But I know that, Mobius there at the end says an interesting line. I can't offer you salvation, but maybe I can offer you something better. Whatever that means, Right. And then finally in the credits, we get a book that looks like the Bible. Did you see that sitting open?
I haven't seen that. There's an end credit scene?
No, it's not an end credit scene. It's simply as the credits are rolling and the pictures are going through. They have a book that looks like a historical Bible with the little thumb tabs where you can open to the little books in the Bible. And in this case, the thumb tabs are marked with the same letters that are on the elevator. So different.
I did not notice that. I'm gonna have to go back and watch it.
So, but it looks like a Bible. So again, the heavy religion. I appreciate the discussion we've had here. There's not much that we can say about where they're going or what the message is they're actually trying to get across. But it's been a lot of fun to watch this first episode, to see them dive into religious discussions about, determinism and free will, and just generally, what it means to have three gods who could be lizards, running everything and making all the decisions for all of us. What was that, Jacob?
Or flying spaghetti monsters. Who knows?
Flying spaghetti monsters.
Right? It's just, we don't really know, and we could all be robots and whatever. It's just been fun to see them dive into that. So thank you for the conversation, and we'll see you next time.